Okay, so the third video that I'm making, I can see that some people were confused about how the relationship between the devices that we were learning about and your thesis statement, your argument for interpretation. So let's talk about this. Okay, let's say you're doing summary mixed with analysis. And this is your thesis statement. Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been is a dark coming-of-age story about the dangers that predatory men can pose to young women beginning to discover their sexuality. It is a story of a young woman who longs to escape from the stifling confines of the world of women in the home, where she is safe but feels trapped in a gilded cage, and longs for the public world of men, a freedom which she doesn't yet know is dangerous for her. In that vein, it is also the story of how unfair her situation is, of the double standards of sexuality for men and women. What devices can you use to hang your argument on? 1. Symbolism. The house symbolizes domesticity, safety, feeling entrapped, the world of women. Cars represent freedom and also masculinity in the story. It's always men who are driving the cars in the story. Music represents freedom, rebellion, and burgeoning sexuality. Connie has a crush on popular male singers. This life is considered rebellious, and it's certainly not the music her sister or mother would listen to. Dress. Connie wears makeup and dresses in a way her button-up sister, who is a foil character for Connie, wouldn't, or her mother, who was once pretty, implies women have the choice of either being pretty and sexual, and therefore sexually objectified, or being plain and sexless. Older women are rendered naturally sexless simply through aging. Point of view. If the story were told from Arnold Friend's point of view, he no doubt would see himself as a great lover, as he tells her in the story. Think of all the stories of great lovers in literature. Casanova, Don Juan, Genji. How do you think the events they describe seemed to the women that they were wooing? What if these stories were told from the women's point of view? This is exactly what Joyce Carol Oates does in this story. And so the heroic legend of the conquering lover with many female conquests suddenly becomes the predatory lover, demon lover. The fact that he cannot cross the threshold of the house but must lure Connie out to him also brings to mind the stories of vampires, stories which are based upon the sexually predatory, as they include romance and seduction and what's ultimately violence. The spell that seems cast over Connie mirrors the spell of a highly charming or convincing narcissist or sociopath luring his prey. Character arc. This is a coming-of-age story, albeit a dark one. Setting, 1950s America, with its cultural shift from domesticity to rebellion. The home-public dichotomy setting is very important in this story. Time. The endless summer and Connie's boredom seems to echo how she is bored with childhood and in a hurry to grow up. Okay, let's look at division and classification. We just looked at this in the last video. Flannery O'Connor is a good man is hard to find, makes use of symbolism and foreshadowing to prove her point about the hypocrisy and sanctimony of the so-called good Christian folk who believe they are better than everybody else. The first symbol of importance is the grandmother's hat, which shows appearances of being a lady and not being common or of the utmost importance to her. Okay, here, I'm going to change this to the grandmother. She carefully selects her clothing for the road trip with her son and his family, thinking that if anything happens to her, at least she'll die like a lady. O'Connor, page number. The character arc of the grandmother's hat reflects the character arc of the grandmother herself, as she slowly has all her values stripped away from her. Another important symbol and sign of foreshadowing is the cat. Traditionally, cats are said to be familiars who tie themselves to witches, which already cast the grandmother in a bad light. It's the grandmother's deception in smuggling the cat in a basket which causes the car accident when Pitty Singh jumps onto Bailey's shoulder, dooming the family forever, and at the end the cat, unaffected by the violence, affectionately rubs against the misfit, who seems to adopt it. The hat then represents the shallowness and ultimate futility of clinging on to appearances of class, station, and Christian purity in an amoral universe. And the cat represents the amoral universe itself, something each one of us carries with us. This is implied by the fact that the whole family kind of has the cat around them all the time, right? The grandmother who thinks of herself as being the, a scion of pinnacle of virtue, nevertheless carries this symbol of the amoral universe with her. What themes are the devices of symbolism and foreshadowing eliminating? Okay, so let's look at these. Here, you have the thesis statement, which is an argument of beginning, middle, of, you start with an overall argument, then your more complex argument that kind of has beginning, middle, and end of what happens, and the arguments that you're making. You're arguing that it's a story about the dangers of sexuality to young women, but you're also arguing that the house represents the world of women in a kind of gilded cage, and that the fact that the public is really only safe or free for men, and sexuality is only really safe and free for men, is unfair. What devices can you use to hang your argument on? These are the devices you're using to back up your argument, supporting when you go through the story. Here, with division and classification, you're kind of doing the opposite. You're already saying what devices you're using, and you're kind of saying what those devices stand for, right? You're using foreshadowing and symbolism and character arc. So what themes are these devices of symbolism, character arc, and foreshadowing illuminating? You're doing the opposite. Here you have, in summary mixed with analysis, you have themes, devices you're hanging your argument on when going through the story. Here you've got devices in your thesis statement. So what themes are these illuminating? Are these explaining? It's the opposite, right? What devices illuminate your themes? What themes illuminate your devices in division and classification? So the themes are hypocrisy, sanctimony, and false piety of good Christian folk who judge others and believe anyone who doesn't think the same thing as them is going to burn in hell. The futility of moral precepts in an amoral universe. The egocentrism of dogmatic religious beliefs is tied to the egocentrism of violent amoral beliefs. The grandmother connects with the serial killer, the misfit. These are all the themes that are being illuminated, right? By talking about these devices of symbolism, character arc, and foreshadowing. Specifically with the cat and the hat and the grandmother. Okay, and then compare and contrast. Well, many believe Joyce Carol Oates' story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, to be allegorical, which is to say, a long metaphor about the dangers of sexuality for young women. In fact, the story is an allegory about the acceptance of death as we grow into adulthood. It is a dark coming-of-age story, but not for the reason most people think. Rather than representing the predatory lover, the demon lover, Arnold Friend represents death himself, which is why he easily casts a spell over Connie, the protagonist, and why she goes with him. She sacrifices her own life to save that of her family when death threatens to come for them first. Common reading. So this is a common reading. Lack of sexual power and the seeming sexual power of attractive women. That agency is stolen by predatory male control. Warning to young women and statement of unfairness about the situation. That's what the first summary mix with analysis is talking about, right? Commonly used supporting devices. Symbolism of house, cars, music, public, point of view, and character arc. Your argument. The acceptance of death is an important part of growing up. Now, I want to make it clear that both of these arguments are perfectly fine. And I actually tend to think, personally, that this is the better argument. Because that's how I interpret the story. As long as you can find evidence, your interpretation is fine, and there is plenty of evidence for this. There's also evidence for this. So what I'm saying is that if you're going to write an interpretation that's opposite of the normal interpretation, you need to make that clear. Which is why all of you need to do research about common interpretations of whatever it is that you're writing about, okay? So, the acceptance of death is an important part of growing up. Say that's your argument. Your supporting device, time in the story, is the biggest indicator of this. Childhood seems like an endless summer, of which Connie begins to grow bored, the way many of us grow bored with life. I'm just tired of the routine and of continuing, right? She goes looking for risks and danger when she leaves the safety of her house. Time seems to speed up when death in the form of Arnold Friends arrives. Everything happens after that very quickly. You can see that in the story and time, right? The turn in the dialogue is another supporting device. The turn in the dialogue is abrupt. Friend goes from friendly, flirty small talk to threatening in the space of a heartbeat, or in the space of one line, really. That's the turn. Just like illness or death can come out of nowhere and happen very quickly, too quickly to stop it. Connie's character arc is one of acceptance, perhaps even enlightenment, not disillusionment. The helplessness that Connie feels in the kitchen when she is enticed to come out is the powerlessness to stay alive when we are slipping away. Connie chooses to come out because that way she can be said to be choosing her own end, instead of having it happen to her anyway without any choice or agency. The fatal attractions of death and the confusion of death with the complete sexual experience, fusion of death and sex in the adolescent mind. Evidence for this is Connie's fear of and attraction to Arnold Friend, as well as his supernatural abilities to know everything about her and her family and to mesmerize her out of the house. This makes it seem that he is death, or death in some other supernatural form, such as the devil, a demon, or a vampire, rather than a psychopathic human being. Here is the link that I gave you on the original page about death and the maiden. Okay. Just put it in like that. Okay, why wasn't it found? Hold on. Was it not the full link that I copied? It should be. This is beneath the story in the D2L. Above the video, this was the link. Yeah, okay. So that's the correct link. When you go in there, of course, first it's in French, so you need to scroll down. Here it is in English. Joyce Carol Oates talks about how she interprets the story. So it might be worth reading this if you're writing about this story, okay? She actually kind of interprets the story in both ways. That it's a story about sex and death and the fatal attractions of death, but that it's also a story about the dangers for young women, and that these things, in embracing their sexuality publicly, and that these things are not separate. Okay? So I would suggest checking this out. Again, this is in the D2L. Where you read the story, which I believe week 2, yes, week 2, in the web page, right above the video, this link is there, okay? And you can click on it and go into it. This is a hyperlink. So, if you're writing something that's opposite of the usual interpretation, then make sure that you talk about what the usual interpretation is, and then and how it's normally supported, and then what yours is, in a kind of compare and contrast way, okay? You can see how summary mixed with analysis has an argument, usually in several parts, because starts out with an overall argument, then it goes into point by point what this argument is, and it follows a kind of beginning, middle, end structure, just the way your paper is going to follow, and then you need to find devices that support your argument in this story, okay? Division and classification talks about the devices that you're already using. You need to then talk about what themes these devices illuminate or describe in the story. So these two are kind of the opposite, if that makes sense. Summary mixed with analysis and division and classification. And then compare and contrast. Either you could compare and contrast two works, like say you could compare two stories that are kind of similar, let's say Bullet in the Brain and Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and how they're similar or different, or Langston Hughes, Harlem, and Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, because she based it around that poem and how they're similar or different. Or you could compare the usual reading of whatever you're working on with your interpretation, okay? I encourage you all, please do research. Look at SparkNotes, look at lit charts, look at research, do research in the library to find out what are the usual readings of whatever you're talking about and figure out your own argument. I hope this has been helpful. All of this stuff I'm also going to put along with these videos into the D2L. And I think I'll put them into week 8. Okay? Into Module 3, Unit 1. And I'll see you next time. Look forward to an email from me.